Now, this illustration still deals with general requirements in general. And notice NEC 250.24A1 and the informational note are going to be discussed here. We outlined that in the loop previously, but this figure is going to deal with some important information. To start with, look at the overhead drops to the left of the illustration at the top. Notice those would be considered overhead service drops if they're identified as overhead type drops. If it's customer-owned drop, in other words, the customer owns that pole and that transformer, fed from a substation maybe, then it'd just be service conductors. This had to be identified, because notice if you're service drop conductors at the top, you would reference 230.24 because they're service drop conductors. But if that pole is owned by the customer, then those service drop conductors there would comply with Article 399 and 225.18 of the code. Now, drop down and let's look at the underground. Now, if the utility owned that transformer, that underground run there would be considered a utility lateral. And it would have to be a minimum of 24 inches deep from finished grade in most all states, counties, and cities. But notice on the other hand, if that was a customer-owned transformer, and the customer put in those conductors and used rigid metal conduit, with that there was electrical ordinance or utility guideline that said otherwise, they don't have to be 6 inches deep because they'd be classified service conductors and they'd only comply with the table 300.50 or table 300.5, depending on the voltage. Now, that's what this illustration is showing, how we would make the calculation and so forth, which we'll get into greater detail. But we know since those service conductors is outside 225.2A1 A and B, we're going to go over to 215.1, or excuse me, 215.2A1A to get our calculation rules. But if it's service lateral, then we look at 230.42A1. So we have to know what are we dealing with. Now, let me point out that when I was the chief inspector for the city of Fort Worth, and maybe you've been a chief or an inspector somewhere as well as an electrician or designing engineer, notice that transformer, if it's customer owned, utilities in some cities have an ordinance that says it still has to be at least 2 foot deep. But if there's not an ordinance or utility rule, and you put it in rigid, it'll only be 6-inch cover from finished grade because it's customer owned. Then again, remember, inside the building, Article 215 deals with feeders. But on the outside the building, you're in Article 225 for any conductors outside the building. So we have to have a classification. Is it service? Is it feeders? And this, these definitions in Article 100 define what I'm telling you. And those definitions of service drop, service conductors, utility service lateral or service conductors is defined in Article 100 and used in conjunction with 250.24A and the informational note. And that's what this figure 16-22B is illustrating.